Welcome to the Pilot Records Database webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions throughout the meeting, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. We do have the Pilot Records Database support team on the call today, so they may try to answer your questions as we go along, or our speaker, the program manager for PRD, Chris Morris, may even be able to answer them live when he's giving his presentation. So yeah, please use the Q&A box for all of your questions. And then any other questions that we have time for at the end, we'll try to get to those as well. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Chris when you're ready. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, thank you so much for everybody joining this afternoon to talk about reporting records into the Pilot Records Database. This is the second time that we've presented this actual webinar, and we're really happy to see it's well attended today. So thanks a lot for that. We have quite a bit to cover, and I want to make sure I allow some time at the end for questions. So I'm going to try to just go ahead and get started. We do have a little bit of housekeeping just to kind of chat about as we kind of make our way through. I did want to give you a slide that has just the folks to contact, or kind of who's running the Pilot Records Database. By the way, this presentation, this PDF, we'll make it available as a PDF document. It'll be posted at prd.faa.gov. It'll take a few days for us to post it over there, but maybe next week, check back and you should be able to download this as a PDF. And we're also going to work to have this available as a video recording as well. Both of those will be at prd.faa.gov. But I mention all that really because there's going to be a lot of information shown to you today, and it might be really hard, to make notes and keep up with it. So just know that we will make the presentation file available. Plus, there are some web links towards the end, and that's not very helpful to you just to see it on screen as a web link. We get that. But when you download this as a PDF, you'll be able to click on those links, and it'll be, super useful, I think. So anyway, just to kind of recap, we're with the Aviation Data Systems branch in Oklahoma City. My name, of course, is Chris Morris. I'm the PRD Program Manager. I'm assisted by Stacy Smith, and also by a team of other folks that help us. We kind of refer to them collectively as the PRD admins or the PRD support team. And they're also on the call today. They're going to be helping me in the background to answer questions that you folks type in. So they're here helping us, which is super handy. Ashley already covered this, but just kind of to reiterate it, questions will be responded to if you type them into the Q&A box. And some of the questions we'll answer, like by texting back to you in the Q&A box. Some of the questions, they might take more research, it might be a little more complicated, in which case we may have to wait until after the webinar, in which case we can really give you a thorough response. And then some of the questions we may pick out an answer at the end of the webinar content. We have a few minutes hopefully here at the end. So either way, you will get your questions responded to. Just know if it's not today, it'll be by email, probably following up in a few days. And I give you the web link there again, prd.faa.gov. That's where we try to put all of our different resources under that one website so you can find it. So let's go ahead and kind of start into the content then. So what we're going to talk about for the next little bit is, super high level, how to report pilot records. And kind of what that means is we're going to talk about the who and the what records, and when records have to be reported, and of course, how do you actually report records. Now, this is sort of a high level look. We're not digging down into the specific record types, because we just don't have time to do that in a 1-hour webinar, but we are going to have additional webinars soon that will really dig down if you're looking for those details about, well, what are all the details on reporting a training record, for example. Okay, so those are coming, but we will cover it kind of high level today. And then, of course, at the end, we'll take your questions. So let's just go ahead and start into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the who of reporting records. Who has to actually do this? And the first question really has to do with Part 111 applicability. But there's also another little component to the who, and that is who or what type of PRD user can actually report records. That's more kind of a technical question, but we're going to answer both of those so that you can get yourself set up to be able to make those those record reports. So let's talk about Part 111 applicability. So super high level, the folks that have to report pilot records starting June 10th, which of course, was 6 days ago. Part 121 air carriers, 135, Part 125 operators. That does include Part 125 LOTA holders. Those are letter of deviation holders. Also applies to Part 91K operators, air tour operators, and then there is a group called, we'll just call corporate operators. I know that's seems super vague on the face of it to say that corporate operators have to report pilot records. So we do define it a little bit more with the intention of making the number of impacted folks a bit smaller. So really what we're talking about, and you see it there kind of to the right of the slide, is Part 91 operators that operate 2 or more type-rated aircraft or turbine-powered rotorcraft, and it's in furtherance of a business. Okay, so that's going to exclude an awful lot of operators because really we're talking about just those that are operating, think like business jets or, folks like that. So, so that's super high level. The type of reporting that these folks have to do, it kind of varies, and we'll go into that a bit here in today's presentation. The other side of the coin about who can report pilot records is that technical question about, well, what kind of role does it take in the PRD system? How do I actually do that? So just to try to keep it simple, there are about 3 types of user accounts, or what we call roles, in the PRD system that can report pilot records. So authorized responsible persons can report records, proxy authorized responsible persons, and then there's another role called an authorized user contributor. It might be, I know that's kind of a strange name. It might make more sense if there was a hyphen, like you'd be authorized user hyphen contributor. But anyway, that's what it's called, authorized user contributor. Just focus on the contributor part. Now, if you want to have a contributor role, you have to register for that role via the PRD website. And then your registration gets approved by either a responsible person or maybe a proxy responsible person, or there's another role called a user manager. They can also approve those. The real important takeaway here I want to highlight is that if you're attending this webinar and you're already a responsible person, you don't have to do anything. You already have the permissions to log in and report records. So you don't have to register for anything. In fact, you're not going to see a role that says authorized user contributor when you log in. It's just part of the permissions that you have as a responsible person. So anyway, most of you that don't already have roles today but need to report records, you'll be looking for that contributor role. That's what you're going to need to add. So the next question about reporting records in general is the what. What records need to be reported? And there's kind of 2 characteristics that help us decide if a certain pilot record or needs to be reported or not. So the first thing is the type of the record. We're going to look at those examples here in a second. The second thing is the age of the record. So if you have the right combination of the right type of record and the age of the record is appropriate, then you would report that record to the pilot records database. So I'm going to show you a few ways to sort of figure out this whole type and age sort of question, because I know it can get a little bit complicated. So let's drill into the types of records. Now it's going to vary based on the operation type. So Part 121 will be a little bit different from 91K. Corporate operators have a different list of records to report. So the place to go look to see what type of records apply to your particular operation is in the Advisory Circular 12068 Juliet. There's a table there, table 2-2, that lists off those 5 basic types of records to report, and it kind of tells you who has to report them. This is an excerpt of the table. We're not going to go over it in great detail here. I just want to give you kind of a little overview. So the thing that you'll notice about table 2-2 is it has across the top, this top row, it has these various types of records, the 5 main types. So drug and alcohol records, training records, disciplinary records, separation of employment, and then finally, verification and motor vehicle review. So those are the 5 broad types. And then if you look down on the first column, you'll see the different types of operators that I described on the previous slide. There's 121, 125, 91K. So you just find whichever row applies to your type of operation. And then as you come across, you can see, what type of records need to be reported. Now, more specifically, like exactly what types of records, you have to go to the appendices in the back of the advisory circular, because that will really break it out. Most of that is around the space of training records. That's the one where you really get the most variety, because different folks do different, they have different training programs. So there's a lot of variety then in there. So the other question is the age of the record, because, if they're old, they may not apply. So let's look at the age aspect of it. There is a really important definition that if we cover right away, it'll really make this age discussion make a lot more sense. So I want you to think of June 9th and back. So from June 9th and then go back in time to August 1st, 2010. And then for some operators like Part 121, that actually goes back further to August 1st, 2005. But just collectively think about any records that are dated from June 9th and then back in time, back in some cases as far as 2005. We refer to those collectively as historical records. So whenever you read in the AC or you're looking at the regulation or whatever, or you hear us talking about it, when we talk about historical pilot records, we mean anything that's dated June 9th or older. Okay, so that kind of, it's a pretty easy demarcation line. So then, of course, anything from June 10th and ahead, that's just referred to as new pilot records. Okay, so if you hear us talking about you have to report new pilot records within 30 days, and you think, well, what does that mean? What's a new pilot record? Well, that just means any record dated on or after June 10th. Okay. So now that we have those 2 main definitions kind of covered, now we can kind of look at how this is arranged. So again, back to the AC 12068 Juliet, there's another table there that describes by operator type how far back you have to report historical pilot records, or even if you have to report them at all, because a lot of operators don't have to report historical records. Some of them only report new records. So this is an excerpt of the table against table 2-1 in the AC. And you'll notice that it has, for the most part, I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to that first row that says records predating 2005, because essentially you can just ignore those for PRD purposes. Anything older than August 2005 is not reportable at all into the PRD system. So let's look at the next row down where it says records dating from August 2005 through July 2010. So those are only reportable by just a handful of operators. And I don't really mean handful by there's not many of them, but I mean it's not a wide variety of operators. So if you just look to the right, it says must report. And if you look up and see, well, what's that column called? That's Part 121 and 135 air carriers. So if you're not a Part 121 or a Part 135 air carrier, then you don't have to worry about historical pilot records dated before August 1st, 2010. Those older records just don't apply to you. But if you are a 121 operator, then the intention is that you would report pilot records going back as far as August 1st, 2005. And then the next row down says records dating from August 2010 up through June 9th. So that's obviously a very large time frame. And if we look to the right, it says must report. That's again the Part 121, Part 135. They have to report that. And then the next one over is a larger group, but it also includes Part 91K operators. And the last row is the new records. And that one's really easy to define because new records are just anything dated on or after June 10th. So you can see basically everybody is in the must report group and they have to report those records. By the way, if you're looking at those subscripts like the 5 and the 6 and the 7, and you're like, where is that? It doesn't say what it is. This came out of the AC, right? It's like a screen grab. So if you go look at the table 2-1 in the AC, it'll have the footnotes there. But anyway. So this is a different view, kind of a graphical presentation of what I just said. So because I know it is complicated, I tried to offer you another view of it so that maybe it'll help make a little more sense. So imagine here you have all these different types of operators and they're reporting records to the pilot records database. That's the PRD there in the middle. And then what we're going to do is we have these 3 color-coded boxes, and these represent the different date ranges. You can see the blue box is the super old historical records, 2005 to 2010. Okay, those really old records. And then we have an orange box, and that's still historical records, but not quite as old, but pretty far back. It's 2010 through June 2022. And then we have the green box, which is nice and easy. That's just new pilot records. And again, you know what that means. That's anything dated on or after June 10th. And so we have those 3 different color codes. And so all I'm going to provide here for you is just these color codes so that you can see which operators have to report what date range. So if you're an air tour operator, you see you just have the green color. You say, okay, I only have to report new pilot records. So it's just another way to consider the information versus the table on the previous slide. But I hope that sort of helps because I know it gets really complicated when we're talking about the time frames and things. So the next part of the question that we have to answer is, once we've figured out what records are reportable, well, when do you have to have them in? That's a very common question. So we're going to try and clear that one up for you today so that you have a better understanding of when these things are due or when do you have to start reporting them. So new pilot records is what we're going to start, just because it's a little bit easier to define and discuss. You already know what new records are. Those are any pilot records generated on or after June 10th. So it's kind of easy to identify. Generally speaking, those records should be reported into the PRD within 30 days of creation or otherwise becoming final. There's some details in there, but that's just, if you have that general rule of thumb in your head, you'll be fine to know that new records need to be reported within 30 days. So, so that's pretty straightforward, generally speaking. There is an exception that I just want to mention here. We probably won't go into great detail, but I do want to just give you awareness of it. It's what we call the PAC exception. And PAC stands for public aircraft operations, air tour operators, and corporate operators. So if you are in the PAC group, which is, again, public aircraft operations, or PAO, air tour operators, or corporate operators, you have an option when it comes to reporting pilot records. Generally, what the option is, you can either report the pilot records within 30 days, just like everybody else. That's an option that you're welcome to exercise. Or you can instead, you can hold on to those pilot records for 5 years. And then you only have to report the records if someone actually comes asking for them. So, and the reason for that is we received a lot of feedback during rulemaking from particularly these groups that said, look, we have pilots that never leave us. Once they come to work for us, they work for us for the rest of their careers. And yet you're making us report all these records and there's very little turnover, et cetera, et cetera. So we came to a compromise and we said, okay, that kind of makes sense. So we'll give you the option of reporting on request. There are a couple rules around it. As you might imagine, there's a couple of exceptions. There's certain records that you must always report. I'll give you a super high level example. If you are a corporate operator and you say, well, I'm going to exercise the pack option and I'm not going to report records for my pilot unless that pilot's moving on to another employer and I'm asked for them. There is an exception. One is, for example, termination. Okay, if the pilot, for example, gets I'll just say to get fired, for example, right? That sort of record is reportable to PRD automatically within 30 days. You can't hold on to that for 5 years. Anyway, take a look at the AC. I've given you the paragraph reference there, 2.8.1.6, where it talks more about it. But I just wanted to let you know that there is such an exception, and we hope that provides some reporting relief for the PAC group. So the next bucket to consider is all those historical records. And you remember, historical records are any pilot records dated before, well, let me just say on or before June 9th. Okay, so all those are considered historical records. So let's talk about when that reporting begins and when you have to have those wrapped up and in the system. So reporting historical records begins June 10th, or I should say it did begin June 10th, because what Part 111 says is that if you have to report historical records, you shall begin reporting historical records on June 10th. Now that's pretty vague. It doesn't say how many that is. It doesn't say, you'll report 10% of your records in the first week. It doesn't do that at all. It just says that you'll begin. So, quite literally, that could be you report one historical record on June 10th, and you're good to go. You're meeting that requirement. But the agency does have some due dates that kind of work into the future. Okay, so the first one is a year from now, June 12th, 2023. So what this says is that you have to finish reporting the more recent historical records in a year. Okay, just to put it in plain language, you're supposed to start reporting records on June 10th, and you got to finish them in June 2023, the more recent stuff. And you might say, okay, well, Chris, what is more recent? What does that mean? Well, we have defined it. It's in Part 111. So more recent just means basically records from 2015 and up. Okay, so like the last 7 years. So another way to phrase this is that you have a year to report the most recent 7 years of historical pilot records. Okay, so, but it's up to you if you want to try and get it all done in the first quarter, or if you want to just enter one and then do nothing until the last quarter, or say the last couple months, maybe April of 2023, you say, oh gosh, we should enter these records. How you time that is literally up to you. It's just, however you want to arrange that. Okay. And then, of course, there are some older historical pilot records that go back before 2015, all the way back to 2005, right? For some folks, you have to finish reporting those really old ones by September 2024. So that's another, year and 3 months, to get those remaining records reported. And something really important happens in September 2024. That date, PRIA, the Pilot Records Improvement Act, sunsets, it goes away. So that's why you have to have all of the pilot records in the system by then, because come September 24, we can't also use PRIA to share records, because today we can share records under PRD or also under PRIA. We have kind of a dual process going. But that's pretty important deadline for September 2024. So I think the last question here before we go into the demo is the how do I report records? There's two basic options or systems. One of them is a web-based form. We sometimes call it the manual form or the manual process. And this is what I'm going to demonstrate to you today. And then the other option is an application program interface, or API. And this is intended for some operators. If you have electronic record keeping systems, you might have all these pilot records, not in paper, in a file cabinet, but you might have them stored electronically. And you're like, well, why do I have to, hand type all these records into this web-based form? Why can't I just upload it? So that's the idea with the API. The API is not available yet. It's in development. We anticipate having the API standards published by September, or in September, let's say. And we anticipate having the API available for actual use by December of this year. So that's why we're not really talking about the API today. We will have webinars about that, but we're just going to demonstrate the manual web-based form, because everybody can use the web-based form. It doesn't matter if you have electronic records or not. It doesn't matter what format your records are. Everyone can use the web-based system. So that's why we offer it that way. All right, so let's go into the demonstration here. So this is a high-level demo. It's just designed to give you an idea, okay, of how the reporting works. I'm going to show you two examples. I'm going to show you an employment record, how you might enter an employment record. And then I'm also going to show you how you might enter a training record. So those are the two. There's 5 total types of records that are discussed in the AC, and we're just going to look at 2 of them. API, I mentioned this already. We'll cover that in later webinars. And then CAC 12068 for specific program guidance. That means like exactly what type of records do I have to report and that sort of thing. We do also have some like guides, like how-to guides and things at prd.faa.gov that go into more detail about how exactly do I report a pilot record, like step by step with screenshots and stuff. And we are going to have additional webinars in the future that will really dig in. Like we'll pick one type of record, for example, training records, and that's all we talk about for a webinar, the specific fields and that sort of thing. A couple of things about reporting. So there are no test records. There's not like a testing server. You have to actually, this is a production system, and there are no demonstration pilots. You have to actually remember that this is a production system, so you can't really just go play around. It's also important to note that records can't be deleted. So if you say, well, I'm going to just play around and create a record for myself or whatever, you can't delete it. So that's important to keep in mind. All right, so let's just go through the demo. So of course, this is from a perspective of an operator trying to report a pilot record. So of course, you start from prd.faa.gov, and you're going to click on the tools button, which is there on the website. Of course, you have to log in. This webinar doesn't go into the login aspect of it, but this should look familiar to you. So you log in by putting in your username and you click next. It's going to ask you for your password and your 2-factor authentication. Then it'll log you in. And then you should land on the role selection page. And this is where people that have multiple roles get to select, what kind of activity they want to do in this session. So in this example, you can see I've selected the authorized user contributor role. Remember that if you're a responsible person, you won't see that role. It'll just say responsible person, but that's fine. It'll still let you report records. I also have to point out, you'll see the redacting. This information, these screenshots, it's like test data, but it could have similar names or whatever to real life people. So we said just to be safe, we're going to redact it. So I know it's ugly, but it shouldn't really impact the presentation much. So forgive my redacting. So you'll select your carrier name and then you hit select, and then that logs you in. You land on this page, which we call the inbox. And the first thing that you do when you want to enter a pilot record is you have to go to the pilot search menu, and then you have to look up that pilot. Like, just think of it like you have to select your pilot, establish the pilot, and then you can start entering records for them. So you click the pilot search button, that takes you to a new page where you can enter the pilot certificate number and the pilot's first or last name. That's super handy that you can do first name or last name, especially if it's a pilot that, maybe they changed their last name after they worked for you and you don't know the new last name. That could be tricky. So fortunately, you can search by certificate number, and then you do have to provide either the first name or the last name, but not both. Kind of, whatever is easier to search by. Then you click search, and it's going to make sure that that's a valid airman. The PRD is going to look that person up. So you see in this example, it did find a single pilot that met that search criteria. And so you'll be able to look at the name and say, yep, that's the person I'm looking for. And there's a button that says view. And that's basically where you like select them and start viewing their record. So you click the view button. And this logs you into where you can actually start to report records for that pilot. You can also see any other pilot records that your company has reported, which is good, right? Because it's kind of up to you guys how you annotate that you've reported a certain record to the system or not. But this makes it handy so that you can look and say, oh, wait, we already did that check ride. We didn't, whatever. So this page that opens is the employment records. And you can see in this example, there's 2 rows in this table, which means that this operator, this fictitious operator that we have here, they actually reported 2 different employment records for the same pilot. And on this same page, if you scroll down, of course you can't see it because the screen here is not tall enough, but if you scroll down, you'll see this form. And this is the employment reporting form. So this is where you would go if you didn't already have an employment record and you're like starting from scratch. This is your first time here and you want to start reporting this. So the only thing that you're required to enter at a minimum is the date of hire. And so, and that's defined in part 111 is, the first time the pilot is required, it's like required training or something of that sort, right? They're required to start, they start work for you. So you put in the date of hire and, any other fields as appropriate. Say we'll have a webinar that goes into more detail about reporting these particular records later. This is just meant to be an overview. And then you just click save. And after you click save, it's going to add them back to that table. So you can also edit an existing employment record. And that's probably what I would encourage you to do. Like, if I were an operator and I had a pilot and, maybe I do one employment record when you hire them, 3 years later or 10 years later, if they go work somewhere else, you don't have to create a new employment record. You could just edit the first one and include the date that they left, if that makes sense. So if you want to edit it, you just have to select the box next to the record you want to change, and then you hit edit, and it pulls up the details that are previously in there, and you can just edit that. So like I said before, you can't delete records, and you can't change the pilot that's assigned to the record, but you can change information about the record. Okay, so if that makes sense. So you would just change whatever that you needed to change in the record, and then you hit update, and it's gonna make the change. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. So let's go on to another example, and I want to show you how to add a training record. So you'll notice that we have across the menu an option for training. So you click the training button, and that will take you away from the employment records over to the training records. And it opens that page up. And the first thing it's going to show you is all of the training records that you've previously provided. Again, super handy so that you can see what you've already reported. Again, sorry for all the redacting, but I think you still get the idea of kind of how that's set up there. Each row in the table is a different training event that was required to be reported by part 111. So again, you can't see it on this presentation, but if you scroll down on this page, then you'll see the reporting form for a new record if you need to report one. you know. And we'll just kind of step through this just to kind of show you how this works. I hope that you'll see it's not incredibly burdensome, the amount of information you have to provide from a training record. So you'll just report, I don't have, pointers onto each one, but just to look at some of these fields here. So you have start date. So, that's kind of self-explanatory. Enter the date that the training event or checking event began. If it ended the same date, you don't have to provide an end date. It's optional. If it was a multi-day or something, event, then you could have a later end date. It's fine. And then you have aircraft make and model. There's a big list. Obviously, you start typing, like say you type, CE dash, and all the Cessnas will pop up. It's like a smart search, and you can, fish through there and find your aircraft. You can click that button. This is view list, and it'll show you all of the available aircraft from which you can select. I will give you another, a couple of hints about this one, just because it comes up a lot. The first thing I will mention is I know people are often like, well, I don't know how the FAA spelled this particular, commander or, Boeing or whatever, how is it spelled, and you're having a hard time finding it. A really easy answer, especially if you're an operator that has op specs. If you will look in your aircraft authorizations list, that's the same list used here in PRD. So the same abbreviations used in your aircraft authorization list is the same abbreviations used in PRD. So hopefully that's helpful. So if you have trouble finding the right aircraft, that's a way to sort of figure it out. And the other thing I want to mention, because it comes up a lot, is people ask, well, what if we have a single event that is training people for multiple aircraft at once? Great question. Our general advice is we don't need you to enter, 3 different training records for the exact same training event just because it happened across 3 different aircraft, especially if it's satisfactory. You think about what's the value that brings to the next employee, the next hiring company, so we generally advise, just enter it once and just pick one of the aircraft that's applicable. And if the event is unsatisfactory or incomplete, then we would say, for sure, enter the aircraft associated with whatever was incomplete or unsatisfactory, if it was even aircraft specific, right? It could have been something that wasn't at all related to the aircraft, in which case it kind of doesn't matter what aircraft you pick, if that makes sense. Anyway, so because right now the system will not let you select multiple aircraft at once. We'll think about that, and maybe that's something that we can work on in the future. But right now, it just lets you pick one. And the last thing I'll say about it, it's perfectly okay if you want to enter multiple records, one for each aircraft. It's absolutely fine to do that. It's not going to hurt anything. Then you have duty position, PIC or SIC is your only choices, and then training and testing program. Of course, you can't see it here, but that's like a smart list, and it has all the different types of programs available, and you just pick, whichever one applies to you. And then the result, satisfactory or unsatisfactory. Anyway, I'm not going to dig any more into that. I'm just kind of looking at the clock. I want to make sure I save some time for questions, but we will have another webinar that digs, really down into these sort of discussions about, these edge cases and whatnot. So the point of this webinar is just to give you a general idea. So then you would hit save, and it's going to add that record to the list of events. And like I said before, you can of course edit a record, but it can't be deleted. There is something that we'll mention here, and that's called suppression, or you can suppress a record. And I just wanted to introduce you to the concept of how that works in PRD. So as an operator, there may be situations that require you to make a record basically hidden. Think maybe there's a court order, for example, I don't know. But there is a way for an operator to suppress a pilot record. And then when that happens, the pilot can't see the record and neither can future employers. They can't see it either. The only one that can see the record that it's there is the company that actually created the record, if that makes sense. So it's not delete, but it's pretty close. It's about as close as you're going to get with PRD. So we do have several resources. And again, these are web links that will work when you download this PDF file. I know they don't work great here. You're just looking at them on screen. But just to kind of let you know, these are some places I would point you. And just really all of this is available at prd.faa.gov. This is just meant to kind of be a little bit quicker way to grab things. So the next webinar is June 22nd. And that webinar is going to talk about managing records and record requests. And what that means, because I know just to hear that, you might be like, that doesn't make any sense. What that is about is there is a concept in the PRD system. I kind of mentioned it previously for the PAC group, where there may be records that belong to a pilot, but they've not yet been entered into the system. That could also apply during this transition phase, right? Because it's going to take a while for all these historical records to get reported. So the PRD has a process built in where a new employer can see if there are old records available, but not yet in the system. Okay. Or likewise, the new employer can see PRD is completely up to date for a particular pilot. That's, of course, the best option, because that means all you do is look at PRD and you've got all the records. But especially during the transition and then later for the PAC group, there has to be a way to request records. And so that's what this next webinar is about, is it will explain to you as a new employer how to request those records, what's the actual process. And then it also looks at it from the previous employer perspective of, how do you get notified that you need to report these pilot records? And then how do you do it? How does that work? So that's what the webinar is about, coming up on June 22nd. It's a little bit in the weeds, but it's super useful for operators. It's not really something that pilots would find much value in because they're not really part of the process there. But anyway, the schedule is for additional webinars will be posted at prd.faa.gov. So we have about 15 minutes remaining. I think what I'd like to do is ask Scott. Scott's one of our PRD folks to help. I'd ask him to look through the questions and see if there's some that we haven't answered yet that might be good for a collective audience. And then I will try to answer them here on the call. And Scott, do you have anything in there?
Oh boy, do I have a lot. All right, so for a Part 135, sorry, Part 135 initial hire check ride that incorporates multiple elements during the course of that check ride, is that event recorded with the drop-down menu, initial competency check, or something else?
I think I understand the question. And if I think I have it in my head, that's a really popular question. That's a good one, Scott, to bring up. So I think what you're asking is when there's a single, let's say a single flight event that might be satisfying multiple checking events at one time. So for example, let's say that you're doing a Part 135 check ride and you're going to do a 293 initial check, and you're going to do a line check, and you're going to do an instrument competency check all at one time. So technically that's 3 different events, but they're happening in the same flight. I'm going to just go with that's the question. So if you look in the back of the AC, there's an appendix that talks about Part 135 training, and it talks about what events are reportable. And if you look in there, you're going to see that each of those events, I'm pretty sure, working off memory, that each of those events is a separate line item, a separate reportable event. So you're going to see that there's a line check, and there's going to be an instrument competency check, and there's going to be an aircraft competency check, and they're all listed individually. So because they're listed individually, the expectation is that you would report each of those events as a separate record, because the PRD is not going to let you, like it has a drop down for 135, 293 check, and it has another drop down for 297, but it doesn't have one that says 293/297, if that makes sense. It's not set up that way. So in that case where you have, each of those line items is listed as a reportable event, each of those would need to get tagged into PRD, even though it happened on the same flight and the same oral event. So hopefully that answers the question. If you need more information on it, maybe drop us a line at prd.support@faa.gov and we can go into it more.
All right, next question. Regarding the negative drug and alcohol tests, the chart only shows positive tests and negative return to duty tests. So are no negative pre-employment or randoms required?
Yeah, good question. PRD, you have to remember that PRD runs alongside and parallel to any other drug and alcohol record review requirements like Part 40. And I have to be really careful because I am not a drug and alcohol expert. Our office, AFS 620, we manage the PRD program, but we do not manage the drug and alcohol, abatement program. So it's important to keep in mind that you'll see that those two programs, like what you have to request under Part 40, is not going to be exactly lined up to what's in PRD. But PRD comes from a perspective of what type of record is worth reporting, because what kind of record has value to the next employer. And the reality of it is a negative drug test on its own, like let's say it's I hope I'm not misspeaking, but let's say it's like a random, a random alcohol test that comes back clean. That's not useful information to a new employer. And so we're not going to make folks report that sort of stuff into PRD because the value that it offers is quite low. However, a failed random alcohol test is very important. It's very important, right? So that one is reportable to PRD, but that may be different from the reporting requirements under Part 40. I just can't really speak to those sorts of details. I'd have to refer you over the Drug and Alcohol Office for that. But I think the only negative results that we take, I can only think of a couple examples. I think we do a return to duty, like a follow-up test, like a return to follow-up test. That's not right. Return to duty test. That one is more relevant when it's a negative. So I think that one's reportable. But anyway, I hope that gives you a basic idea. If that doesn't satisfy your question, please shoot us an email at prd.support@faa.gov. But we'll probably refer you over the drug and alcohol folks because they're really the experts. Thanks, Scott.
I'm going to address one question real quick because it's popped up a bunch of times here in the last 5 minutes. A pilot does not need to grant your company consent in order for you to post employment records for them. The consent is only for a potentially hiring employer to review those records.
Yeah, that's a great point, Scott. Thanks for addressing that. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing the pilot has to do to allow you to report records. You can report records with absolutely zero contact with the pilot. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah. Regarding Part 125 operators, this company currently has 2 full-time pilots, and then they use contract pilots as needed. Are they required to provide historical records for every contract pilot used dating back to 2010?
My qualified answer is going to be yes. I only say qualified because I reserve the right to change my answer if I get more information about the situation. But Part 111 does not specify if the pilot is a direct employee or the pilot volunteers her time or the pilot is contract. Part 111 doesn't care about that. It just says if you've used this person, you can maybe think of it, this might be easier way to categorize it. Just, if you've exercised operational control over that airman, there's no training for 125, but let's say you did the checking activities for Part 125. Then, if you have those records and you did the checking, then you'd be the one expected to report those records.
All right. And sorry, there are a lot of questions in here, but maybe not all of them are going to be helpful to a lot of people. But we'll go with this one. Flight safety and CAE have been known to delay access to 8410s for more than 30 days. What would we do in this case?
Okay. Well, it's kind of an interesting issue. I think that you would be probably fine to say, well, the 142 center, their record is going to be final when they deliver it to you, right? I think that would make sense. So, once the 142 record is final, then you would have 30 days to report it. That's an interesting scenario because, let's imagine that you have a crew member who is, out of grace or about to be out of grace time, and they go to 142 and they get their flight checks done. And then, the very next week, you're operating that airman on the basis of their check ride they just took at the 142 center. I think, at that point, we're acting like that record is final, right? Because you're exercising operational privileges on that record. So I kind of think that would start your 30-day clock. But it's a great question. And, I think a lot of these sort of individual scenarios really should be discussed with your local FAA office, because really it's your CMO or your local FSDO that's going to be even doing surveillance to see that you're reporting these records. So, if you guys hash out an understanding of, okay, well, look, flight safety gives us the record here, we're going to get the record in the PRD here. I think that would, I'm sure there could be some happy land there. But I think it's a great question. Probably want to discuss it with your CMO or local FSDO just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Great. Here's one that we've seen in the past, but I think it's good. If a pilot died prior to 6/10/2022, did the historical records need to be entered into the PRD?
Yeah, great question. I'm pausing because there's so many different variations to this. So if we look first at the statute, what does the law say that has to be in PRD? The law says that the records have to be in PRD for the lifetime of the airman. Now, the FAA has interpreted that to be when the pilot is 99 years old. So after 99, we don't have to report records for them anymore. Or if the agency gets, some notification, like some sort of evidence, I suppose. I don't know the answer on that one, but if the agency gets notification that the airman is deceased, then we would no longer need the records in PRD. But that's a great question. How do you actually execute that? Because it kind of feels like it might belong to the Airman Certification Office, because they're the ones that maintain all the records on pilots, certificates and medicals and things. I think let's tag that one, Scott, for future follow-up. Let's do a little more homework on that one.
Okay.
Because it's a great question. And we need to have something sorted out on that one.
All right. And I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay.
What if the training position and duty position is different? For example, a pilot is pilot in command trained, but assigned as second in command. The field says duty position. Do we track training curriculum or position assigned?
That's a good question. That might be another good question for your CMO or local FSDO. My initial thought, though, just first response is going to be whichever curriculum that you have selected, because the curriculum normally specifies if this is an SIC curriculum or a PIC curriculum. Whatever curriculum they're using, that's what I would tag it as.
And so I think this will be the last one. Pilots need to register in PRD and grant company access for a max of 60 days before we're able to update records. Oh, wait, I think we maybe already got this one. Oh, can they grant for any longer period of time? Answer that is no. Yeah, actually, I set that one as answer live. I think that was the one that I specifically chose whenever I was reading it and said, oh, this needs to be addressed. Sorry.
It's okay. So maybe one more if you have one handy, Scott.
Oh, I've got oodles handy. It's just a matter of seeing one that is really going to help the most people. So kind of going back on check rides. Check rides must be entered 3 times because 3 items were completed in one event. Will the system ever allow us to control or hold and select multiple events for a single entry?
Yeah, I think we already discussed that, and I think it's a pretty good idea for us to consider. We'll take that for further review.
Yeah, and we still have a bunch more questions, but I think we are out of time.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're out of time. So your questions that didn't get answered yet, we will review them by email and respond back to you. And, it's going to be next week, most likely, right? So, so kind of watch out for that. Otherwise, we really appreciate everyone attending today's webinar. We hope you found it useful, and keep an eye on the webinar schedule for the next webinars. With that, I think we're going to say have a great afternoon. Thanks. Bye.